All right, welcome everybody to a live episode of The Other Side. I am Justin Spears and joined today, as usual, by Mr. Mike Margison and a special guest with us today too, Mr. Matt Newkirk. As I've seated out on our social media throughout the day and leading up to today, we're going to be talking a little bit about education. And so before we jump into any of that, as you guys may have seen, we were trying to get a rebrand going with the podcast for the new year, and really excited about trying to build some momentum with getting episodes out weekly, as well as utilizing and leveraging social media. So you can look for episodes to be put up on our social media accounts on Twitter and Facebook, along with other resources, topics, articles, things of that nature to help carry on the conversation. You know, when Mike and I had the idea of creating this podcast, one of the things that we were really hoping to be able to do is to generate some discussion, you know, to present the other side of these topics, the unconventional side, you know, the side, the standard textbook, the side that you don't hear in the mainstream media. And, you know, we know that sometimes that may be counter to what a lot of people would believe or be, you know, conditioned to hearing all the time. And we thought that might generate, you know, discussion or just topics that, you know, people would be interested or passionate about. And so that's really what we want to do with this. We want to throw this out here for you guys to take in and kind of consider. And then, you know, whether you agree or disagree, you know, like we always say, we're not here to tell you what to think, but just to try to encourage you to think. And so please feel free to use one of those platforms that you feel it works best for you. And you can always email us too at Margison and Spears. That's all one word, Margison and Spears at gmail.com. So having gotten that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and jump into our topic for today. As you guys may or may not all be aware, the three of us are all high school social studies teachers. And so we all have different unique perspectives as well, too. I know I'm non-traditional teacher. I spent the first couple of years of my career in the business world, working in sales and marketing, entered into the classroom a little bit later on. And then, you know, a little bit more of the traditional side from Mike and Matt. And so we each have different ideas and opinions about where we are with education today. And I think the kind of the impetus for why we wanted to cover this topic in here is that, A, we're passionate about education. All three of us, I feel, are very concerned about where we are with the state of education today. And certainly we know we're not the only ones, right? But yet we are connected. And so therefore we felt like it would be a good idea to kind of, you know, bounce ideas off of each other, talk a little bit, hear each other out, and see what we have to say about this. And then, like I said earlier, to encourage you guys as well to think about this and to, you know, communicate with us and discuss this. So I'm going to kind of kick us off here today and talk a little bit about the history and evolution of education. Mike's going to talk to you a little bit more about, you know, the economics and the incentives in education. And then Matt's going to talk to you a little bit about the practical, you know, every day, what he sees in the classroom and reflections on the impact that that's having on students. And I think hopefully what you'll find is that all of those kind of run together and build off of each other. And then we'll wrap it up with the conclusion. So what I want to start with here, fellas, is, you know, by throwing this out here, and feel free to speak up to this and comment if you have anything to add here. With this being the other side, you know, we always talk about, we want to present the other side, the unconventional portion of a topic here. Let's talk about the conventional definition or thought of education, right? Education is seen the way that it's set up today as it just has to exist this way. You know, when you start talking about reforming education, you just get people that can't conceptualize education that doesn't look like, and by education, obviously referring to primary and secondary education. You cannot get people to really conceptualize anything outside of what currently exists, right? You know, a standard building, brick and mortar, you know, technology is changing a little bit, but, you know, your standard classrooms with, you know, desks and chairs and boards and things of that nature, textbooks and stuff like that. And, you know, yeah, you'll get some people to maybe buy in on homeschool or virtual school. Seems to be coming getting a little bit of footing and everything. But is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what I want to kind of talk about, and I think what you'll hear from all three of us is, how can we challenge that? What can we do to push back against that, and to really get people in this country and in our communities to think about reforming education, and what steps can be taken. Obviously, this isn't something that you're not going to overhaul the entire country's education system, in a short period of time, and it may not even happen in my lifetime. But we can at least start talking about that. So let's start with some history, right? Let's start with where did the idea for this come from? Where did the idea of what we see as education being compulsory, education looking like what it does today, looking like what it did when you went through school, no matter what your age is. And what we do is, or what I've done is try to go back at least and look a little bit at what Horace Mann and his impact was. And that may be a name that you've seen, placed on a building somewhere, or maybe of a Horace Mann High School. I think there's one. And also talk a little bit about John Dewey. And I'll start with Mann. Mann was one of these guys who was a Whig back in the 1800s, and he takes a position in the state of Massachusetts as their basically superintendent, director of education. And he's looking at a way in which, we can model education and build it to look like something that's going to pass down tradition, something that's going to educate on the 3 R's, that kind of traditional model of education. So what he and a number of others during that period of time did was they went over and they studied the Prussian model. Okay. And what they found was, hey, this is a great way to be able to control. I guess that's the word I'll use. I'll go ahead and use the word control, right? To build out kids to become productive citizens in society. And you could even fast forward this a little bit toward the late 1800s and tie this into what men like Rockefeller wanted to do. And he certainly was a big proponent of funding this model, right? You basically bring the child in, you educate them on these basic skills, but what your end goal is you're trying to create a product of a productive citizen, right? Somebody that's going to be a good worker. And what does that mean? Well, it means you got to learn time management. You've got to have a schedule in place, right? So the whole notion of schedule, the whole idea of placing students in grades, that way when you're graduating them, you're getting a new crop of students, that are on pace and on target to be able to fit into the corporate model. And that really kind of becomes the model for American education. In the remnants, much of that is still in place, even today. And we'll talk a little bit about the detrimental end of that here in just a little bit. Well, clearly that, meets the labor movement in the early 1900s, and that meets resistance. There are all kinds of people that are seeing this, and they're disgusted by the fact that you would use schooling as a way of preparation. It's just kind of like, the assembly line, of taking children and rearing them in the schools and getting them ready for work. And so you get men like Dewey, who are social progressives, and Dewey's a psychologist. He's somebody who is looking at what's going on in schools and has a lot to say about raising the child up in social consciousness and awareness. And it's more about what we would probably hear today as educating the whole child. It's a little bit more about finding that child's niche, sweet spot. And it's definitely more, I guess the word that I kind of thought of as I was reviewing through this and reading about it is kind of finding what works for that student, right? And educating to him or her individually, and helping them to understand who they are, getting in touch with emotions and things of that nature. So you've got these two forces now that are working against each other in the way that I interpret it and see it. And so I think this sets us up for the question that we still need to answer, in 2018, and that is, what is the purpose of school? And I posted that up on my Facebook page. I've got a lot of friends who are educators, and I was really kind of hoping to get a little bit more. I got about 5 or 10 responses from various different people, some of who are in education. And I got a mix. I got a mix of, education is, schools are a place where students are educated, to obtain skills to prepare them for their future. And that was kind of a standard line. Although I did see some acknowledgement of the social aspect of what school brings, that it's a place for social development and things of that nature. So a much more Deweyan approach to what school should look like, and that being what the purpose of the school is. And so I guess as I kind of transition out of my part here, what I think about what I've seen in my time in the classroom, and I'm coming up on my 8th year in the classroom now, I see aspects of both of these things, but it seems like to me, I've seen a struggle. I've seen a struggle for the old guard that wants to keep a part of school to look like you go to school to learn. You go to school to learn certain facts, and you've got to have this base knowledge. We couldn't, because of time constraints, talking about like curriculum and grades and things of that nature. And maybe, Matt, maybe you might hit a little bit on that with what you're going to talk about. But certainly then trying to reconcile that with, if you focus on that, you're going to be giving up some of the social aspect, right? Because, in order to be able to focus and build out an education that is focused on content and curriculum, then the social aspect is going to suffer, and vice versa, right? If you build a school out that's focused more on socialization and consciousness development and understanding your place in the world, then that's going to be more the focal point there. And you may get some content, but it's certainly not going to be content driven the way that a traditional school was. So I hope that makes sense, right? I hope that's kind of the model that I have at least experienced and seen as the biggest problem that we face today, is trying to find the balance of that, not wanting to sacrifice content knowledge and getting students baseline foundational information that they need, but also to, at the same time, not sacrificing the social aspect of that. And what this has led to is who gets to make these decisions, right? And that's clearly where legislators have come in. And unfortunately, on both sides, right? Republicans and Democrats, no matter who's in charge here, we see they flub it every time. They can't get it right. And at the local level, we see this, at least here in the state of Indiana. We see our politicians that are blind to understanding the wants and needs of educators in the state and of students, what their wants and needs are. And then certainly at the national level, when the Department of Ed was created nationally in 1979, it was a totally unconstitutional move. There is nothing in our Constitution that gives the general government the authority to regulate education in this country. And it has had nothing but a disastrous effect on education. I don't care. You can talk to me all you want about the money and the funding. I don't care about that. It has had an absolutely detrimental impact on education in this country. And again, I'll pick on No Child Left Behind. I'll pick on Race to the Top. I'll pick on Common Core. This is not a partisan issue. This is a fundamental government is not the solution issue. And so I think as I kind of wrap up here and talk about what can we do, at least from this perspective of historical progression and evolution of education, so what, right? That you might be thinking, so what? What are you saying? What I'm saying is we have to have control at the local level. First off, the states need to put their foot down and tell the general government to go pound sand, take a hike. We don't want to hear it. Education is ours. And then even within that, local school districts should be looking at their states and saying, you are here to help guide us along the way, not to dictate to us, not to mandate to us what we should and should not be doing. Even within a state the size of Indiana, the students who attend schools in the region, their wants and needs, and for those that aren't familiar, the region is up near the Chicago area, the northern part of the state. Those students' needs are going to be much different than kids who go to school, like, let's say, in the foothills of Indiana, more along the Ohio River. The kids that experience school in the city of Indianapolis are going to be different from those in Fort Wayne and Evansville and Gary and those who are in more rural areas. Those local school districts are the ones that are going to know what their students need. Those local school boards, superintendents, and educators are the ones that are going to know what their students need and should be in control of education and educating the children of those regions. So, having said that, that's kind of my bit and thought on this. I know it's a really, really quick run through, but just hopefully kind of planted some seeds out there for you to think about. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, good stuff, Justin. Anytime you're going to tell the federal government to go pound sand, I'm on board. So
absolutely,
I appreciate that. All right, yeah, kind of what I wanted to start with is going along the lines of the way that you began, but this is just something I was thinking about the other day. This year, my dad turned 80 years old, and about 2 months to the day after that, my oldest son turned 5. So if you're a social justice major, that's 75 years between the two. That is 3/4 of a century between the two. And virtually everything that my son is going to do in his lifetime is going to, of course, obviously be drastically different than what my dad did. Everything that my son does in terms of the way he interacts with people, the way he communicates with people, the way he reads and acquires news, the way he entertains himself is going to be foundationally different than the way my dad did it, with the exception of the way that he is schooled. That's going to remain pretty much the same. And what's unbelievable is even in certain places, kids are going to be going into the exact same building that possibly their grandfathers did, with maybe some improvements or, whatever, renovations. But the process has not changed, right? The process is virtually unchanged, not just in 75 years, but in the almost 150 years that you discussed since the time of Horace Mann, when they put forth this factory model of the school system. And I'll acknowledge that, of course, there are some differences in the tools, some internal differences in the tools that are used in education. So, we went from blackboards to whiteboards to interactive whiteboards, and that's helped, of course. But those are internal improvements and internal differences, and they've had a really nominal, negligible effect on educational outcomes. But there have been no external, no foundational changes to education. And this is one of the things that education suffers from, in my opinion. Different than every other industry in this country, every other industry in the world, education suffers from a lack of innovation. I mean, every single other industry that I can think of has progressed and improved over time. And it's done this through, there's like a twofold process that industries go through. It's innovation and imitation. And if you think about anything, whatever, telephone or movies or the way that we listen to music, once somebody innovates, and then once somebody innovates and there is a better way of doing things than the previous way, then everybody imitates. And what you get there is new ways of doing things gradually replace the old ways of doing things, and better ideas gradually replace older ideas. And you have this constant process of change, adaptation, and eventually progress. And that entire process has completely missed education. It's been absent. We haven't seen the innovation. Well, there has been innovation, but it hasn't been imitated. It hasn't gone through that process of that kind of global process that we've seen with communication and other industries. I was just reading an article today about a new GM car that is being developed without a steering wheel. I mean, even the way that we drive is innovating. I don't know if I agree with this. I'd prefer to drive myself, but look what's happening to cars. First, they had these internal improvements, but now that's going to be a thing of the past. I'm guessing by the end of my lifetime, where we no longer control them. They see, it's parking themselves, and now they're driving themselves. But the process of innovation and imitation has been completely unable to permeate the education industry. And one of the reasons is because the major mechanism behind innovation is absent in education. That mechanism is the ability to profit, and that's what spurs innovation. And that mechanism is gone in public education because it's a government-run industry, right? These are government schools, and I don't mean to say that like these are communist factories, but they are government schools. I don't get to choose. The method of education, or my principal, or locally, we don't get to choose how we're going to educate kids. There are rules set in place by the state government that says you have to come here every day for this long and do this, and these are the requirements. So these are government schools, and this has been typical in economics, and we've discussed this on podcasts before. In fact, we even discussed this last time when we talked about Venezuela. But government-run industries, they fall behind because they lack innovation, and education, unfortunately, is not an exception. So,
can I jump in for just a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're talking about this, and you're talking about like innovation, and people are innovating, as you said, and there are some really creative school districts out there. And while you were talking about that, it just made me think of a conference that I had gone to last summer, one that actually your wife helped put together here in Lafayette for educational technology. And one of the keynote speakers was the superintendent from Eminence Schools in Kentucky somewhere. His name was Buddy Berry. And he had been a teacher and kind of became disenfranchised with the entire educational system. And he decided that he wanted to advance up to the level of superintendent and revamp an entire school corporation that was a failing school corporation. And he did some really creative things and basically made it a requirement that his teachers all had to be innovative. So he kind of like bucked the system a little bit in that regard. And they've like turned an F school system. Like I think every school in the system, if I remember his story right, all of the schools were F schools. Based on the grading scale, and they're now all A schools and like are thriving because they do things completely different and really innovative. But what strikes me is that like school districts like that can succeed, but yet what you said, that imitation really isn't happening.
Correct.
And that's what's disturbing is that I feel because it's so government run that ultimately people aren't incentivized to take those risks, even though there's evidence that they work. It's easier to play it safe.
That's absolutely true. And I remember the guy that you're talking about. That's a good example. I didn't think to use it here, but my wife told me about that keynote. That was at the Ignite conference last summer. But yeah, and she told me and showed me one of his speeches, and it was really inspiring. But yeah, it is a twofold process. And I read a quote, and I don't remember exactly who it was from, but a guy said that there are great teachers and there are great innovations. And unfortunately, a lot of those ideas pass or die with the teacher. And that's true, because unless you have the second, prong of the fork, the imitation part, you don't have the widespread, you don't have kind of that viral impact that you see, in like music, Walkmans, which, even in Japan, they thought, the Walkman was a stupid idea. And then all of a sudden, like, look what happened to that. And then the Discman, and then the iPod, and then, streaming music. And that's just been this massive, widespread innovation followed by imitation, which again, unfortunately, we haven't seen in the public school system. But so what is the end result of this? I mean, the results are that it's going to be the same thing for my son as it was for my dad. Kids don't like school. And you might look at that and say, okay, obviously, like that's obvious. Kids don't like school. Duh. No. Kids like education. I'm convinced of this. Having done this for the last 12 years and coming across all kinds of kids, I do know that kids actually like learning. Kids like being educated. Kids like seeing the light bulb go on. What they don't like is schooling. They're bored by it. And this is where we tend to lose kids. If our goal is to educate, then schooling needs to change. Schooling needs to go, in my opinion. But it definitely needs, or at least this current version of schooling needs to go. So I'm going to end real quick with what is probably just a pipe dream, but this would be my vision for what education / schooling or whatever you want to call it would look like. There's a couple of conditions here if it needs to be effective. Number one, it cannot be state governed. I mean, this is one of the problems. There has to be that mechanism that allows for innovation and imitation to take hold and spread virally like it has in every single other industry in our lives and on the planet. So it can't be state governed. I know that, and look, I can get it. You might say, okay, well, how's that going to look? And that would take a long time for me to get into, but the corporations would have to be private rather than public. And I know even when I say that word, some people are going to tune out like, oh God, corporation, Walmart. No, this isn't like, billion-dollar industry or anything like that. That's not what I mean by corporation. A corporation is just a legal description of ownership. So it would have to be a privately owned corporation. There'd be valuations in the land and the building. And you would have essentially an employee stock ownership plan where, the teachers are the predominant shareholders in the school. And that's one of the ways that it could function. But you would have to transition from public to private ownership. But secondly, and I think most importantly for me, is it's got to be non-compulsory. I mean, it absolutely compulsion does not work. Right? Education would have to be non-compulsory. And so just the way that I'm envisioning it is you would have, like any other business, I suppose, you would have a time when the door is open and you would have a time when the door is closed. But other than that, the kids come in and they seek out what they want. The bell schedule is gone. And the bell schedule, this is one of those things that kind of like Justin was talking about, and this is one of the things that's unchanged between my dad to me to my son. You walk in, you hear a bell, and then there's this Pavlovian response. We get up and we move, and I was doing math, and now I hear a bell, and now I go, and now I'm speaking Spanish, and then I hear a bell, and then I get up and I read poetry. And I mean, if the objective were to confuse kids, this would be the number one way to do it. But all of that would be gone. It would essentially work on a scheduling, and like scheduling. Kids would come in and they would go up to whoever is proficient in, let's say, the sciences. There would have to be somebody on staff for that, and they would say, "Hey, look, here is what we want to learn." And just like any other business, you look at your schedule and say, "Hey, from 10 to 11, this would take me about 5 weeks. We could do it 3 times a week, I think, in order to be able to meet the objectives that I want you to meet." And that's the schedule. And then the kids either show up or they don't, but it would have to be non-compulsory. And it would also have to meet the needs, not just kids who were interested in science, but it would have to meet the needs for all kids. So you would have to have a lot of public-private partnerships, which I think these would be easy, but you get cars that come in from scrap yards or, just local mechanics who are looking for somebody technically skilled who can do the job, or HVAC companies come in and say, here's how you take apart a unit. Here's how you put it back together. All of that stuff would need to be present in this model. So it would have to meet a variety of needs also. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of stop there because I could go on and on. But
hey, Matt, real quick before you jump in and do this, I do want to follow up one thing with what Mike was saying there. There is a option out there called the Sudbury School. I would encourage the listeners and viewers, if you're listening to this back on playback, there's a gentleman named Tom Woods who does a podcast, and he had on a representative from the Sun Valley Sudbury School, I believe it was, in Framingham, Massachusetts. And there are Sudbury schools in various other places. Well, I believe there's one in New York, and the original, I think, is like over in Ireland or Scotland. But essentially, it is like total student-driven responsibility for education. They are the whole stakeholder in their education, and it does annihilate this idea that, okay, at 8 a.m., from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., I'm doing math. And then whatever I'm doing, I've got to stop there because daggone it, the bell rang, and now I've got to go to science. And so there's some, I'm not saying it's perfect. I haven't done a lot of research on it. What I heard was intriguing. And I think it would be the closest thing to the practical side of what Mike is talking about.
Are there age cohorts? Do you know? Because that's another thing that would have to be eliminated. I mean, grouping kids by age makes virtually no sense.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think, if you might have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, that might be, somewhere cognitively, because you get to pick and choose what it is that you go through. So if you decide, hey, I want to learn about algebra, then you can get other kids. Again, I don't know that there would be any kind of age limit, just whoever's up for it and feels like they could do it to take that on.
Yeah, awesome. I had heard about that as well. I didn't recall the name of it, and I heard a young lady speak from the Sudbury School, and I think one of the common objections is, oh God, if you do this, well then nobody's going to get educated, and so they're all just going to sit home and do nothing. And she had agency over her education. She was very well spoken. So, but there are other reasons why that's just a simplistic and lame argument anyway. But I'm going to cede the floor and turn it over to Matt.
All right, I'm just going to dive in. We're all high school teachers, so I think we all have kind of a similar perspective when we look at it from purely like a secondary education perspective. We're not, we haven't been in the elementary classrooms, and we haven't seen that. But I do have the good fortune of having two young boys who are both in elementary school right now, one in first and one in third grade. And as they got into public school, I've kind of, they don't attend public school, they attend private school. But as they've got into elementary school, what I've realized is that elementary school has changed since the time that we were in school, and not changed for the better. One of the things that I've really noticed since I started teaching overall, since I started in 2007, is that in general, there's been a lack of creativity. I know Mike and you and I have talked about this before with students that we've had over the years. But I felt in my first couple of years, I had like probably a majority of my students who I felt could do really creative things when asked to do. And like in world history classes that you and I would both be teaching at the same time, we would see projects that were really well done, video projects with technology that was far inferior to what we actually have now, with kids having really good video cameras on their phones. They were using camcorders and little flip cams that we could check out, or even iPod touches back in those early days of those projects. And yet we were getting some really good work. But over the years, I just feel like creativity's gone down, and I feel like a lot of that goes back to what's going on in elementary schools. That kids aren't being given the chance to like play and be creative. And honestly, I was just having this conversation with one of my colleagues the other day about being in kindergarten and learning how to cut things with scissors, and the kid in the corner eating paste, which sounds ridiculous, but it was just time to be creative and learn from experiencing that way. That just doesn't exist anymore. Now it's all about math and reading. I mean, literally every night my kids come home with math and reading homework. And I don't fault their teachers for it, because ultimately that's what they're tested on. At the end of this year, my son's going to take I-STEP for the first time, and he's going to be expected to be really proficient at math and reading. So, of course, all of the focus is on math and reading, and even things like science and social studies and the arts, those things all get pushed aside. Not that they don't do them at all, but they're not there as much. And a lot of it, can be traced back to No Child Left Behind, when the emphasis on standardized testing really ramped up to chase that money that Justin had mentioned earlier. And one of the other things that I think has come from this, and the evidence, the research kind of supports this, is that kids aren't built to sit in a classroom all day, and now all of a sudden everybody under the sun is diagnosed with ADHD. I think the statistic I found was that after the passing of No Child Left Behind, ADHD cases rose by 22%. And it's an epidemic. Everybody's on some sort of ADHD medicine now. And it takes away some of that creativity and that just general curiosity that kids have. Not all kids are going to be perfectly well-behaved, sit there silently for 8 hours a day kids. That's just not how humans are designed.
Just a quick side note, I hate the fact that that's called a disorder too. It just that has bugged me to no end, especially having two toddler boys. They have attention deficits. There is no question about that. But I don't see that as a disorder. I just wanted to throw that in. But sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. But like I know when I was in grade school, and I don't know, maybe you guys can share your experience here, but I had 3 recesses a day. We had a morning recess, a recess immediately after lunch, and then we had a real short end of the day recess. And it broke up the day. And I remember, obviously looking forward to recess because every kid looks forward to recess, but all of the things that you can actually gather out of recess, and the research backs that up. That I was reading a study from 1997 from the Journal of Sports and Exercise and Psychology that said that regular exercise absolutely improves mental function. They did a number of different studies and approved that. And there's all kinds of other studies out there that prove that. And a lot of school corporations around the country are starting to recognize that and go back to it. But I still see that is a major problem. But it just limits those kids' creativity, chances to be creative. But I don't know. Did you guys have significant amounts of recess when you were in school?
I was eating paste most of the time. So
corner, that makes sense.
Well, we did, and the other thing too was, and it's interesting because we're all kind of in the same boat. I've got a 4th grader and a 2nd grader. We didn't have the specials rotation that these guys have now. I remember doing music and gym. And we might have gone down to a computer lab to use the old Commodore 64 just to get kind of, introduced to it. But they have a whole special dedicated to it. They have a day of the week that they go to the library and everything. And so, all that time, even beyond just the devotion to math and reading is being eaten up with other stuff as well.
Yeah, but it feels so regimented in just the way elementary school goes on. But again, I can't necessarily speak to how everything looks in the day-to-day. It's just kind of talking to my kids and kind of experiencing that. So that was my first point that I wanted to get into. But kind of back to where all of our focus really is at the high school level. My thing that I've noticed the most about students beyond their lack of creativity is just the fact that everybody is chasing points. Even our best students, ultimately, they're just chasing points to try to get a grade, and learning is secondary. Kind of going right back to where you started this whole conversation, Justin, was what is the purpose of this school? Is it to prepare people for the future? Because you can jump through these hoops and you can get these grades and you can get your college diploma or your high school diploma and then ultimately go on to college. And that's great. And you probably will do fine and get a job and be relatively successful. Or is it for us to actually teach these kids how to think? If that's the goal, then the grade system as we do it is the most nonsensical thing that I've ever seen. We attach arbitrary grades to somebody completing a worksheet or completing a project that has no real significant meaning whatsoever. It's just something that we do. And, full disclosure, Mike and I, we sell lesson plans on Teachers Pay Teachers that, basically feed right into that that mentality. These are projects that, while are good for the school system that we currently function in, they don't necessarily inspire too much, outside the box thinking. It's complete a task, get some points, get a grade, and move on. And that, to me, it just seems like a broken way to do it. Why aren't we inspiring kids to pursue things that they're actually interested in? I mentioned this when I joined Mike last week on the podcast, that I did a 20% project this year where the kids got to pick their topic of interest, and I had a kid who literally sat down with his church group and his dad, and they figured out a way to get a scholarship for a girl from Haiti. Like, to me, that's like being creative. It's using your resources. It's learning ways to work and educate yourself in a way that's totally different than what you're going to get in a normal classroom environment. But he learned so many different skills. He learned communication skills. He learned financial skills. He learned, how to operate within bureaucracy. All skills which translate to the real world. So,
which class was it? Was it world history?
This was in world history that I did the 20% project. But again, that it could be any class that could be in. It could even be its own possible separate class. But to me, that's education, and it ties so many different things together. Like you were saying, we're going from a Spanish class to a science class to a math class, and that's how kids view it. It's like, I'm doing Spanish now, so I can't think about
there's no
literature, or I can't think about history. There's no connections between them because they're just machines moving from one thing to another because of an arbitrary bell.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the reason I asked about the class is because what you just said, it seems like anybody would be able to see that there is an infinitely more value in what this kid just did than understanding, the medieval pyramid, and you know what I mean, whatever we used to call that thing, the social pyramid, social structure in medieval life, for instance, or whatever it is that the state standards tell us. And these are state standards that come from legislators who are not educators, and that's obvious, but that's who's dictating our education. And the Republicans in Indiana have been particularly putrid when it comes to education, because it's just stupid things. And some of the stuff they have to respond to at the federal level, especially the No Child Left Behind and the Race to the Top, where, but what we've seen seems like you can't have a half day. You have to go X amount of days, and you have to make them up. And if you go, it's just nonsense stuff that people who are down in the trenches actually doing this know that what they're doing does nothing to advance education.
Yeah, I think one of the things, to be frank, that I actually disagree with you on is the idea of not having standards. But I think that the standards are ridiculously too specific. Like, I think that if you're going to have a world history class, I think there should be standards, and that, like, maybe one of the standards is you talk about world religions, or you talk about war as a concept, or the environmental impact on culture, things like that. I think that big, broad picture standards that, kind of lay out what all students should kind of have a concept, an idea of the concept of, should exist, because I do think that it's risky to basically say, hey, here's a world history class, do whatever you want. So I don't mind the idea of broad standards, but it's like when like you said, mentioning the feudal pyramid. Okay, well, that's one thing that's happened in the history of the world that was a relatively short chunk of world history. Do we really need to spend a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks talking about specifically medieval history, or can we just talk about political structures or governmental structures over time and why they come about? Like, more of a thematic based approach, and give us the themes. That's fine. I don't mind someone giving me the themes that I have to work with, then give me the flexibility to work within those themes that I think will make sense for my students and at my level and at my school district.
Yeah, you're right. We would disagree there. I would trust you to come up with the themes on your own, but that's to say we're splitting hairs. Justin, jump in.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm thinking about here, guys, that I'd be interested to get your input in here is, as I've listened to you guys talk, and certainly I think I tried to hit on this as well, is what's the common theme here for why this thing is all mucked up? And it's government, right? At every level, at state, local, and obviously at the federal level. And, you think about the fact as to why government has become so entrenched and invested in education. And when you look at the direction that the country has gone from a general government perspective, there's been more of a unified, if you were to say, for example, like, not to get too deep into the woods here, but like, what the incorporation doctrine has done to the states, and how there's just kind of this, what was it Reagan did, a nation in crisis, or I forget the study that his
nation at
nation at risk. And there's, we got to compare to the Russians, we got to compare to the Chinese, we got to compare to this. And so this emphasis on standardized testing and standards, and, Matt, you mentioned chasing after points for a score, because that equals, I've got to be the valedictorian or salutatorian. I've got to get scholarships, and I've got to get this college degree so I can get this job. And, everything's like linear in terms of thinking about, the steps along the way to completing education. If we would just kind of eliminate that and take a more individual approach to what education should mean and look like for us, I think that would do a couple of things. I think number one, it would restore the idea of having a desire to want to learn. These kids show up and they couldn't care less to learn about economic principles, how our government works, why world history is important to understand. They just don't view it as something that is a passion to want to learn. And I'm sure that's true in other content areas as well. So I think it would help restore a sense of desire to want to learn. And then ultimately what I think it would do is it would give kids more of a sense of purpose, exactly like what you were talking about, Matt. Getting to kids who have a passion and a desire to want to do something and build off of that and let them run with it. Because I'll tell you what, you guys have all seen it. We've got those kids, those 15 to 20 percenters that have absolutely no desire to want to be in the classroom. At best, they're going to put their heads down and keep quiet. At worst, they're going to be a classroom distraction. Those kids would be better served being in a machine shop, a woodworking class, being in a home ec type, whether it's cosmetology or nursing or whatever it is. Let these kids get out and run with their interests, and let's educate them along the way instead of fitting them into this one size fits all, because a student who goes to school and experiences a student that goes to school in Idaho or Arizona, that's completely erroneous. Those students live completely different lives. Yes, they're Americans. Yes, they live in the United States, but the skills that they're going to need to be successful are vastly different. Their desires, their needs are going to be completely different. We've got to return autonomy to the local school districts.
I agree with you. No argument here.
Yeah, you're not going to get much argument from me.
So, I think, guys, that's kind of where obviously, as I said at the beginning here, it is therapeutic to do this. It is something that I enjoy doing because, as I said at the beginning, we are passionate. We have kids that we see in our classroom each and every day. And I know that we can identify many that we say, man, there's so much potential there, but the system is absolutely killing that student. And it is sad. It hurts, honestly, at the end of the day, to walk out of the building and know that is going on, and to feel, I think, sometimes defeated that you can't do much to push back against that. There are some things that you can do to try to help and stuff, but at the end of the day, it can kind of get us down. Let's leave with some ray of hope or bright spot. What do you guys see as maybe on the horizon, or something that you experience in your classroom that we can leave with a sense of hope as to maybe some change or something positive? Matt, I know you mentioned the 20% time. Maybe that's it. There, Mike, do you have anything in particular?
Well, what I said is, look, I've noticed that kids really do like to learn. I mean, they really do. They like to get educated. They like it when you can bring a concept to them with a little bit of a sense of humor, when you can break up the monotony. The kids love it when you do something that is a little bit off script, that a lot of the teachers might be afraid to do because somebody's going to walk in and evaluate them, or they're not going to be able to reach all of this, especially if you're in math or English, they're not going to be able to reach all of the standards. But there are a lot of handcuffs, I think, that are put on teachers. And sometimes I've noticed that if I kind of strip them away or do just something even innocuously off kilter, the kids really enjoy that. I mean, there's just, it's the process of education they like. It's the schooling that they can't stand. And so the desire is still there, that wanting to just gather knowledge, just that desire to gather knowledge is still there. And that still drives me, when I teach, when I see that.
Yeah, something I'd say that really gives me hope is that I think that, I know, Justin, you've had spent some time with educational technology, as have I. And I think the technology, as it makes its way into more schools, you will start to see maybe more of that imitation that Mike talked about earlier. And I know we have all of these wonderful tools at our disposal. And I think as more and more teachers learn how to use them, and we can maybe start to reach kids a little bit more where they are and not feel like we have to, even in the model that we currently are in, where we have to like shove all this information and get away from lecture-based education and more experience-based education. We have these wonderful technology tools at our disposal that I think will make that easier. It's just we're just in such the early phase of this new educational technology world still that it's going to take time. And, you know, hopefully in our careers, we'll see that start to make a difference. But in places where that exists, those are the models that we have to follow. We do have to imitate those people who are doing things differently. Buddy Berry, who I mentioned, the other school, I already forgot the name of the other school that you mentioned, the Sudbury School that you mentioned. Those are things that have the opportunity to be imitated, and maybe we can innovate this industry, you know, from the inside. So that's something that I hold on to and think that even though it's taking time and even though it's frustrating, as a teacher who does try to use some of that when you're looking around your building and realizing that some people aren't, and you give kids like flexibility time to try to be a little bit more creative, and then they use that time to do their math homework because that's still sticking in that same model, that you realize like, okay, take a step back, breathe. This is all going to be fine. These kids are still learning how this is going to go too. They've not grown up in this, and none of us as teachers have either. It's going to take time to fix.
Justin, are any of our listeners state legislators?
Not to my knowledge.
Dang it.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. Now, I will say I do have a distant relationship with a state legislator down in, he's a senator, John Crane from Avon. I've had some discussions before, one-on-one discussions with him before in the past.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I think, Matt, to wrap up here, what you mentioned there at the end, how cool is it on a day like today where here in the state of Indiana, most of the state has essentially been shut down by a winter storm, that there are a number of school districts, including my former school district, Mill Creek Community School Corporation, that is able to do an e-learning day, right? So that the learning process isn't stopped by inclement weather. And I'm sure the kids are probably like, oh, are you kidding me? But you know, that model though, right? That model of like, look, you don't have to show up in a physical brick and mortar building from 8 to 3 in order for learning to occur. You can sit on your couch in your pajamas. You could get up at 8:30, 9 o'clock, eat your breakfast, watch your show. And so long as you can get your tasks done, and, you know, I know it's not perfect, but at least it's kind of building that framework out to break the mold of the hold on, you know, oh, we can only learn when we're here. And then as soon as we're out of there, boom, learning shuts off. And then, you know, that whole process is built into year after year and everything. I think that's a pretty interesting concept and something to kind of build off of what you're talking about for hope.
Yeah, that's exactly like what I was thinking, honestly, when you brought that up, you know, having that ability to learn. Now, like you said, they can complete their task. That's still the fact that we're talking about completing a task on a snow day is kind of indicative of that same task point-driven model. But like you said, it's the model that we're using in order to complete that task that gives you that hope that maybe one day we're not worried about completing a given task on a certain day, but there's just a general curiosity and knowledge that they're seeking, and they continue to seek it when they're not forced to be in the building. Like, it's just part of what they do on a day-to-day basis. So,
yeah. Well, gentlemen, this is certainly a topic and a conversation that we could carry on for hours, and I really appreciate you guys both carving out the time today to make this happen. I hope that our listeners that may come across this, you know, can give some thought into this. And, you know, I think, you know, for the most part, there are obviously many people that are invested in education, even those that may not have current students in schools. Obviously, they're taxpayers, and they probably have a vested interest in their community in terms of the product that gets produced in a local school corporation. So, you know, obviously, this is a topic that affects a lot of people in a lot of different ways, either as a student yourself, an educator, or just, you know, a parent or a citizen in the community that you live in. So I hope that you're able to find some value out of this. And as I mentioned at the beginning, If you have any questions, comments, feedback for us, please feel free to reach out to us through our social media platforms. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. You can find us on there just by searching The Other Side Podcast on both of those. Our email, Margeson and Spears, Margeson and Spears, all one word, at gmail.com. And again, special thanks, Matt, for taking time to join in on these last couple of episodes that we've done. I appreciate having another voice in here as well. I'm sure Mike probably wearies of hearing my voice all the time. So I appreciate you taking time to be here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks for listening today. And you have now heard The Other Side.